on Dagda Twitch. This is Just Bear with Just Bear Chats. Hope you're doing well, and I'm coming to you today wanting to talk to you about a topic that is near and dear to me. Something that I constantly am working with, I'm chewing on, I'm struggling with, wrestling with, and that is being an American in uh, the diaspora of American culture and being someone who is trying and is being led to learn more about a Irish pagan practice that, in all honesty, I really have no known culture or claim to. And I've been sitting on this for a while because it's such a big topic, and I really don't even know where to begin, honestly, most days. But I really kind of hit a little bit the tip of the iceberg, if you will, in a therapy session today. Yes, good Dagda bros and good Dagda folk know that you need to feel your feelings, and sometimes, in order to do that, you need to talk to somebody who knows the language of feelings. And so, but in that conversation, I hit a part that I have had a hard time putting words to, and I wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So, for those of you who are new and this is a very strange start off for you, I am a person who has been born and raised in America. In particular, I live in the unceded territories of the Yakut peoples in the Central Valley of California, and I've pretty much lived in the same place almost my entire life. I've only changed minor, maybe a couple miles at a time, except for a few small jaunts in my 20s, but we won't get into that right now. The point is, I've been born here, I've been raised here. The culture that I really know about is the American culture. And when I was growing up, I got glimpses into what used to be um, cultural relevant things to my ancestors, or at least the stories that were told from my family about certain parts of the blood family, quote unquote. Um, and a lot of those things were either vague or multiply misunderstood from different people and different angles. And long story short is I don't really have a great understanding of my roots and where my roots are. As I've gotten older, um, those roots, which I thought, being an American was a way to be rooted, I began to learn more and more about how people who look like me, white and masculine presenting people who took huge advantage of each other as well as the people that lived on this land and the plants and the animals and nature itself, and destroying the things that they found here. One of those things that they destroyed was the diversity of the cultures of the people that lived here first, the people who came here, and subsequently every new ethnic, cultural, um, uh, diverse part was homogenized as quickly as possible. And as I began to realize that, I felt like I became even more untethered, um, and feeling a little bit of a man without a land, a man who really doesn't have, uh, a strong history or a culture to cling and hold on to. When I started doing some family history in middle school and high school, I recognized and saw some glints of um, ancestral roots in Western Europe, uh, very specifically in the German, in Dutch, or what was called Holland, um, and also in the British, Welsh, and Irish uh, islands. So, I got really excited about that. And I admit, too, that most of my understanding growing up about the Irish and about um, Western culture in general was extremely, and painfully stereotyped and then whitewashed. Um, Pun intended. And what little I really understood was a lot from what I saw that happened in America every March, around the 17th of March, which some of you know is St. Patrick's Day, and very confused understandings around kilts and beer and pinching and all sorts of terrible, terrible accents that were attempted that type of year. So, and of course, movies. When I was very young, because I grew up in a Disney household, one of the first movies I ever saw was a real gem of a movie called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. And as a child, I was enchanted by this story. It's truly horrific now if you watch it. I have joked, Laura O'Brien has joked about doing a watch party and to drink and yell at this movie while we watch her be tortured by this horrific Irish stereotype. Um, but needless to say, I grew up watching that, and as well as being exposed to the John Wayne Maureen O'Hara classic, The Quiet Man, which was a great deal of it was shot in Ireland, and it is supposed to be based on um, a small, sleepy Irish town in the turn of the 20th century. But again, there's a lot of problematic elements with it. But that's what I saw, and that's what I had. Um, so that's what I clung to, and so I had that. A whole lot of other background issues that were going on that also made me feel disconnected. Trauma, not being aware that I was a trans person through most of my life. So always feeling other and outside of what was going on until finally things started to get better. I started to put some pieces together about my personal history, about who I am, and then finally coming to the pagan experience, the spiritual enlightenment of myself, if you will, and beginning to get the call and see uh, the the Irish gods and the Irish in a very different light. However, with that, there came some very real and difficult inner struggles that I've had to deal with and I continue to deal with. Um, a lot of it has to do around me not wanting to do what people call cultural appropriation. Um, Now, what it means and what it now stands for is a little different, uh, but the very basic understanding of cultural appropriation is when another culture sees something from a different culture and likes it, it takes it back and starts doing it. Um, You see this all around the world. Um, when any time another culture comes against another one and starts exchanging ideas. However, the way we know it in popular culture, it's more along the lines of cultural exploitation, which is when a colonizing force comes in and takes things that they like from a culture that they are oppressing and actively trying to destroy, and are also using those cultural signifiers for profit. So, uh, so I became, very aware of a lot of the things that I was taught and a lot of the things that I understood was Irish in America really weren't, and were a very different story told from the people that came over much, much, uh, uh, you know, uh, later, um, and then immediately, got, you know, ground up, so to speak, in the American sausage uh, that we all sort of have to kind of fit into. So, what am I trying to get to here? What I am trying to get to is that even though I have felt a connection, and I will love to talk about this at a later point, um, but feeling called to get to practice and worship these gods, uh, it required me not to just assume that I immediately belonged and owned the culture that these gods come from. Now, this is a particular personality quirk of mine. I am someone who loves to learn, and I am someone who, when they get really excited about something new, they want to learn as much about it as they can. So I kind of had that going for me. My baseline is when I approach something new is that I know nothing. I know nothing, or I try to, you know, uh, recognize that, if I'm coming at something at a different angle, or if I found a new venue or piece of information that I never had, to just look at it with new eyes. That's a technique that I I have honed over the years. Just knowing that there's just so much knowledge out there, and I can't assume that I know everything all the time, right? So I had that going for me when I started my time uh, learning about um, Irish pagan traditions and myths and magics. But there is still this pain that, despite all the work that I do, despite the studying that I do, despite the prayers and the work and the journeying, um, that I am still never going to be an Irish person. I'm still never going to fully um, be able to, claim this, because that isn't mine to claim. And that is an absolutely right and correct assumption. But there is still a pain. And I think a lot of it does have to come right down to the fact that in America, I think a lot of us feel that way, especially those of us who recognize that if our ancestry comes from colonial settlers, um, we got planted in land, or our ancestors took land that didn't belong to them. And some of them were thrown out of or ran away from the countries of their origins. And their family, either out of shame or survivor's guilt or um, trauma, or possibly because they truly hated wherever they came from, they quickly assimilated into American culture and did their best to hide the things that made, you know, them different, right? Um, and so because of that loss, I feel like there is a great desire to find connection and belonging in something we consider ancient, something that can connect us to the greater collective whole, instead of feeling sort of adrift on top of this unceded territory. So, is there an answer to this? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out. And I'm still wrestling with that to this day. And I don't think I'm going to come up with a answer to it anytime soon. But I did want to just put it out there that this is a real thing that I think Americans who engage in particular, pagan, or folks who feel drawn to a indigenous practice that they weren't raised in. uh, I think there's some things that we need to be aware of as Americans. First, just because we are called by the gods, and that's something that I feel very strongly about. Um, Anyone can be called by the gods, and it could be any gods. And our color, our gender, our identity does not hinder that call and does not fracture or weaken that call. The gods are powerful and real, and because of that, uh, if we feel that call, we should heed it. However, I think that when you are coming from a culture that isn't your own, and I am speaking more broadly to an American audience, but there I know that there are amazing people from France. And from I think there was someone from Germany, and other countries that have been coming to the Irish Pagan School live at Fives, um, who've been called by the Irish pantheon. Uh, but again, so this is more about the Americans. It's always about us. Um, we need to recognize that if gods are calling us to a culture outside of ourselves, they're not just calling us to worship them and to make a connection with them. But I think it's also about learning about this culture that these gods or spirits or guides come from. I think that's an integral part of the work that any person has to do when they find they're being called to a spiritual path that is outside of their heritage, their cultural traditions that they were raised in. So, what does that particularly look like? Um, so for me, you know, yeah, maybe 150 years ago, there might have been some family members who came over from Ireland, but I also have a ton of people that in my family tree that came from a whole bunch of other countries. But I don't feel called to those traditions. This is the spiritual beings, and these are the spiritual people that I'm being drawn to. So because of that, I have taken to trying to do a couple of things. One is to learn the history of the land and the people that live in the area of the culture that I'm trying to engage with spiritually. Yes, learning the myths is an incredibly important aspect of that, but more so is understanding current events or um, recent past events of what is shaping the people of that land and that culture today. I think that is incredibly important for us to be doing, because if we are spiritual folks who are working with spiritual energies or gods or guides today, not in the ancient past, but today, we have to understand what that culture from that these gods are coming from have been dealing with, and how they may have changed from their original myths and lore. So that is something that's very important. The other thing is, if there is a native language that you aren't fluent in, you need to take steps to learn at least very basic words and phrases in that language, particularly if you're going to be doing religious rites with these gods, guides, or guardians. Um, for me, what really enhanced my practice was when I started saying the epithets of Dagda, the god that I'm dedicated to, in in the modern Irish. Laura O'Brien, again, shout out Laura O'Brien. She did this amazing video about a year or so ago reciting the Ross poem that had many of the Dagda's names in modern Irish, or her best understanding and translation into modern Irish. And when I started doing that as a part of the prayers that I did in the morning, I had a very real and much more tangible connection to that deity and to the other world when I did journeys. Uh, Understanding the language and understanding the place names and the sacred sites that these gods inhabited um, are absolutely crucial. And that, I think, is just the overall part of the work when you are working with gods, guides, and guardians that are not from your your culture. Um, and finally, uh, there's probably more, and I'll probably be talking more about this in future episodes. But I think one of the biggest things is, um, don't assume, and ask and listen to native voices. I can't tell you that there is such a thing as a monolith a voice in any given culture, and so chances are you will find many different experiences and understandings, particularly in a spiritual context, with the cultures that you are working with spiritually. But it still is crucial that we need to listen, and we need to understand how people are interacting with these gods in their lands. And okay, I'll add one more thing. Other than the work of learning a little bit of the language, at least, learning the myths and learning the history, um, I personally feel it's important to travel to the sites that the gods and guides and guardians come from. I personally have been doing otherworld journeys for maybe a couple of years, on and off. I'm not as consistent as I should be, but that is an important part of me getting to experience Ireland in a way through these otherworld journeys with uh, a guide helping me get there. That's really just a holdover, though, until I make what I consider a pilgrimage to the sites. in Ireland that I feel are important and will help me deepen my appreciation for the gods that literally reached out across a continent and asked me to start paying the fuck attention. Um, I'm not going to cry on this video because that would be, but crying is not a bad thing. Just don't want to cry during this video. But, so I want to leave you with that idea of making the journey, whether it is through meditation or journey or dedicating a eventual trip to the places that are considered sacred, and the home of the gods and guides and guardians that you are working with, I think is a very important step for folks who are working with spiritual energies outside of their original experience. So now I want to hear from you. Are you someone who considers themselves as a part of a diaspora? Are you an indigenous person who is seeing a lot of folks become interested in your culture and the spiritual work that is a part of that culture? What's your experience? How do you feel about being in or out of those cultures that are seeing spiritual energies getting worked up and bringing new people to those experiences? I'd love to hear about it. Go ahead and share with me in the comment section. And speaking of shares, if you enjoy this video and you'd like to get more people involved, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And you can also send me an email if you have comments or questions that you don't want other people to see at justbearchats@gmail.com. Finally, if you like what I'm doing, please consider giving me just a little tip, a price for a cup of cheap coffee at coffee/Dagda Bear. And until we meet again, I wish that you stay safe, well, and well fed.